Hey, good afternoon, everybody. I am Matt Scalisi back with another edition of AL.com's Playoff Central, the show where we are getting you guys caught up on all of the latest headlines from Alabama's run through the college football playoffs this year. This show is always brought to you by Medical Properties Trust, who's sponsoring uh, throughout the playoffs all of our great coverage that is being brought to you by, among other people, our good friend Mike Roddick here, who is will be in Dallas later this week along with the rest of our team. But for now, we're all still back home, Mike, covering most of this stuff via Zoom and digital press conference, as we have done with a lot of college football events this year.
Yeah, feels just like last year, and it wasn't supposed to be that way up until about a week ago. We were planning on spending the full week in Dallas and having regular press conferences and actually seeing people in person and talking to them in person. But that changed. I think it was last Wednesday or Thursday before Christmas, and we've gone back to basically the 2020 model where it's all on Zoom and we don't travel until later in the week. But the team actually still decided to travel on Sunday. They had the option of going in on Wednesday, but both teams actually are already in Dallas and kind of going about their normal business.
Yeah, and we'll get into some of that. There were some kind of last minute changes regarding some of that stuff that we'll talk about later in the show. Before we do that, kind of wanted to just dive into talking about the press conferences and the media access that we did get today. Some interesting comments, mostly coming from the defensive side of the ball. That was sort of who they decided to focus on today as far as press availability for Alabama. And I'll quickly mention before we get into that to anybody who's watching, we always love when you guys get involved. Drop your comments in. Tell us what you thought about any of the comments that you saw from the players and the coaches today. If you have any questions for Mike or for me or anybody else on the staff, drop them in there as you're watching the show today. So Mike, we were, as I mentioned, we got some guys on the defensive side and really kind of the headliners. We got the defensive coordinator Pete Golding, but maybe of more entertainment value to the viewers today, we got Will Anderson, really the emotional leader of the defense, really one of the leaders of this entire team for Alabama in 2021. Some fun comments from him that I think show that despite the fact that Alabama is now the 1 seed in the playoff, they're a 2-touchdown favorite going into this game. Will Anderson is still very much trying to keep that chip on his shoulder throughout this week.
Yeah, exactly. Kind of reminds me of, just growing up around the Patriots and covering the Patriots. That's kind of the way that Tom Brady always was. He's Tom Brady, like there's nobody better. But he always kind of had that chip on his shoulder about somebody doubting him or somebody thinking he's going to play until he was 40 or 45 or win 7 Super Bowls instead of 6. And some of it was kind of ridiculous. Like, I don't know if anybody's really doubting Tom Brady, but that's just what fueled him. And I think Will Anderson kind of is wired the same way. And maybe that comes from Saban, because I think Saban's probably, the same sort of guy. But Anderson essentially said that they still view themselves as the underdogs. And, they're 13.5-point favorites. Cincinnati's, a group of 5 team, the first group of 5 team to make the playoffs. I don't know if anybody's realistically expecting Cincinnati to win or even keep it very close, but it worked really well against Georgia. The whole comment from Saban after the game about, the yummy rat poison and how they kind of fed off that underdog energy, and that clearly they played their best when they had that sort of doubt around them. And I think they need to keep it going. And I think Anderson is understanding of that. And it just could be the way that personally he likes to look at things as well. But, I do think, and I've seen it already on social media, people kind of saying, well, they're Alabama, like who's really doubting them? There is a little bit of doubt out there. Even just listening, I remember driving home from Atlanta the day after the SEC championship game, and nationally on the radio, people are saying, oh, Alabama lost John Mechie. Are they really going to win it all? If they see Georgia again, would they win that game? I mean, the betting markets still have Georgia beating Alabama as a favorite outcome over Alabama beating Georgia. If you kind of split it up into all the possibilities of the national championship game, that's still the favorite outcome, is Georgia beating Alabama. So I think there is a little bit of doubt that still lingers out there about Alabama. And I don't think Will Anderson's totally off on that, but I do think that's just kind of how he likes to view things and how he thinks that his teammates need to view things as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that it's sort of possible to be the number 1 team and be the favorite and still especially in Alabama's case, right? Because they have all of these previous championship teams that they're often compared to. So it's possible that there are people who could say this is the number one team. These guys should be the favorites to win it all, and still throw in things like they're not they're not the Alabama teams that we've seen in the past. They have more weaknesses than some of these other championship teams. There aren't any great teams this year. That's a refrain I think that we've heard a lot. So, I mean, I guess it's possible for both things to be true.
Yeah, and I don't think like all those things that were said about Alabama leading up to that Georgia game doesn't mean that all of them are false. Like I think a lot of that
Sure.
was true. The way they played against Auburn, the way they played against A&M, the way they played against LSU. Just beating Georgia doesn't erase all of that, but it doesn't mean that all those things were true going into the game. I think there's a middle ground there that, maybe there's some nuance lost. Like Alabama kind of goes from being this doubted team to being this number one team. It doesn't mean that they're flawless, or it doesn't mean that they're completely flawed when they were number 3 or 4 in the country. So there's middle ground. I don't think Alabama's unbeatable. I don't think they're unstoppable. I think they're very much beatable. And I do think that there is some level, whether you call it disrespect or doubt or whatever, I do think that's out there. Like, I don't think Will Anderson's totally off on sensing that, even if it's kind of, made up in his own mind as a
Sure.
motivation factor.
Well, on the other side of that, we did hear. I certainly wouldn't say that it was overconfidence or anything, but I think Pete Golding feels really good about his defense right now. I think in some ways he almost seems like, pardon the pun, but he feels a little defensive of his guys because he knows that they are often picked on as the weak point of the team. And he was asked a little bit about that today, and kind of how that perception comes to be, and maybe what he thinks, why he's not as concerned about it as a lot of other folks. What kind of stood out to you about Pete Golding in terms of being asked about his own defense and how he feels about them right now?
Yeah, well, it's kind of a rare opportunity that we get. I mean, it's only twice a year or once a year that's really scheduled that we get to talk to Pete Golding. That's in August during fall camp, and then we don't get to talk to him again until a bowl game and potentially a second bowl game if they win this one. So it's not that often. So it's not like after they give up the touchdowns to Arkansas or they give up the game they had against A&M, and we can just ask Pete Golding about some of those things right away. So it's sort of backtracking a little bit at this point. But he has thick skin. I think that's probably true about him. And it's the same questions I remember him getting a couple years ago back at the Citrus Bowl, in 2019, after Alabama had lost to LSU, lost to Auburn, and Golding was under a lot of heat that year. They had the injuries at middle linebacker. And, I think he does let some of that run off his shoulders, or, just kind of brushes it off a little bit. And that's kind of where he's at.
Yeah,
But at
kind
the
of
same
a
time,
chill guy, really. Yeah,
yeah, yeah, he's an interesting guy in the sense that he recruits really well for him. He's definitely won some battles for him in Louisiana. Part of that's probably because of LSU and what's happened down there, but he's gone down there and gotten some guys for him. Whether it's JoJo Earl, or Earl's from Texas. I'm thinking of Aaron Anderson, the recruit they just got, the wide receivers coming in this year, and a couple other guys in years past as well. And he's won some battles recruiting wise. I think this defense is still top 10 in the country in a lot of stats, and obviously they proved a lot against Georgia. So I don't know if a lot of the heat is justified. I think a lot of people like to kind of compare it to what their defense was 10 years ago, and by and large, that's just not the way that football is played. I think maybe we thought Georgia
sure.
was that sort of defense this year, and then they go out and give up 40 something points to Alabama.
For sure. I mean, it's been kind of a topic we've talked about on various things throughout the year too. Just the 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 style of football has changed. Sort of the sport has fundamentally changed. I think Saban's tried to emphasize that a little bit too. You're just looking. You're looking at defenses, I think, more on a per possession basis now than maybe you used to. Is when you're trying to measure these guys. But the other thing I wanted to ask you about, Mike, in terms of Pete Golding, I know a lot of fans, uh, particularly from this part of the country, you know, they perhaps are watching some Big Ten football. They're seeing Michigan, Ohio State. They're seeing the usual names that they know are at the top of the polls. They don't usually get to see a lot of Cincinnati football. And I think particularly on the offensive side, it's going to be a little bit of a mystery to a lot of Bama fans going into this game. What in terms of Alabama's defense, what do they kind of view as the big threats and concerns that they're going to have to be dealing with when it comes to the Cincinnati team?
Yeah, I mean, it probably starts with Jerome Ford, who was at Alabama for 2 years and then transferred. He barely played. He started that Duke game, at the beginning of the 2019 season and didn't really play a whole lot after that. But, I mean, he has 20 touchdowns this year, which I think there's only a couple guys in the country who have more than that, total, 19 rushing touchdowns, and he's certainly a threat. On the outside, Alec Pierce is their top wide receiver, taller guy, and Alabama does have some cornerbacks who can match up, and that's kind of been one of the themes the last couple of days here talking to them is that Alabama has these longer corners, Jalen Armour Davis being among them, and it looks like he'll be ready to play from what Pete Golding said. But you're looking at guys matching up against taller wide receivers. I think Alabama has that, and a quarterback in Desmond Ritter who is pretty big, 6'4", about 220, can move around. Maybe not quite as big as KJ Jefferson, but probably some similarities to what they saw there in Arkansas. And I think overall, I remember I got asked this question earlier today, like what SEC team that Alabama's played this year does Cincinnati compare to? Arkansas keeps coming back to my mind, especially on defense. They kind of run the same scheme, a 3-3 stack that Alabama interestingly enough, threw the ball on a lot against
Yeah.
Arkansas. That's when Bryce Young set the record. But Ole Miss runs a similar defense, and that's the game when Brian Robinson ran 600 times. It felt like so. It'd be interesting to see like what they do game plan wise offensively. If they really try to go out and run two tight ends and just run the ball down their throat, or if they try to throw it even without John Mechie. So that's going to be something that we'll kind of see unfold. The first couple series of the game.
Yeah, one thing that I think a lot of people might sort of assume about a team like Cincinnati is that they are unlike a team like, say, Arkansas and Ole Miss. That they don't have the same level of size maybe up front, which we typically would see more of in a Power Five conference or in an SEC team than we would see in a Group of Five team. Is that necessary? Is that the case with Cincinnati? Is there a drop off in terms of the sort of size and athleticism up front for them?
There probably is to some extent. I don't have, the exact numbers. I don't think there's as many, let's say, like NFL draft prospects you're going to
Sure.
see from the trenches from Cincinnati. I think you look at the guys who are potential first round draft picks, is really the two big ones for them are Ritter as a quarterback, and then their cornerback Sauce Gardner is his nickname, and he's one of the best corners in the country. So that's going to be an interesting matchup too. That I think will be talked about a lot the next couple of days. It'll be Jameson Williams against Sauce Gardner, who's top 20, top 25 NFL draft pick in the spring is what he's being projected right now, and apparently hasn't given up a touchdown in his 3 years at Cincinnati. So I'm sure that'll be taken as a challenge by the Alabama offense and Bryce Young and Jameson Williams, but that's kind of where the strength is for Cincinnati, probably a little bit more than the lines.
Sure, and we will hear from the Alabama offense tomorrow and get some comments probably related to that matchup. So I want to bring up before we wrap up today, Mike. We talked yesterday on the show a little bit about the sort of the specter of COVID hanging over the playoffs. It had been a concern for a lot of people ever since we heard those standards about forfeiting games being brought up. I think a lot of people kind of hit the panic button when they heard that phrase. But Nick Saban said as soon as they got to Dallas, we don't have any issues with COVID on the team right now. We know that there's a couple of coaches that will join the team later in the week, but outside of that, no specific issues that Saban mentioned. And then, so some other news kind of related to that today. One being that Alabama ends up closing their practice viewing window for the media this morning, which shortly was followed, I believe, by Georgia and Michigan doing the same thing over at the Orange Bowl. And then the other piece of news that really just happened very recently, a couple of hours ago, is the CDC changing their guidelines on how long they are asking people to quarantine if they do test positive for COVID. So, Mike, this news kind of continuing to come out and change almost every day about how this situation is being handled. But when you kind of take it all in, I guess, and boil it down at the end of today, is it? It kind of feels. I mean, you tell me if you disagree, but it does kind of feel to me like maybe the threat is looking like it's not quite as dire as we were imagining possibly last week.
Yeah, I'd say that's a fair assessment. I think as has happened before with COVID, I think things tend to snowball a little bit, especially at the very beginning of COVID, almost 2 years ago. It's one league does one thing. I think the other leagues feel like they need to follow suit, and um, I think that's kind of what was happening last week. Is the NBA and NHL and the NFL were all making changes, and things kind of followed from that. And then you kind of get to a point of like, all right, does it need to be like this, or can we continue as it is? Do we need to do further restrictions, et cetera? And I think we've kind of gotten to a point where it seems like that slowed down a little bit. And it slowed down some of the stories of things getting canceled and positive tests and all that. So, can that change the next couple of days? Sure. But it feels like the momentum of it has slowed a little bit. And I think people realize, some of the science behind it. And that's probably what the CDC, I think, came out with today is shortening that from 10 to 5 days. And that's going to have an impact probably across all sports, not just college sports, where you have players who have been tested positive, they're asymptomatic, and they've had to sit out 10 days. Well, now that's only going to be 5 days, which is obviously going to affect availability. That's going to get guys back. They could test positive on a Monday and play on a Saturday or Sunday
Sure.
in the case of football. So that's pretty big. But I'd say as far as like the practice aspect and the CFP, for whatever reason, and I'm not on the ground in Dallas enough to know exactly what happened, but it seems like they gave the teams the opportunity today to close practice if they wanted to, out of COVID concerns from what I read and relayed from people there. And that was given across the board. At that point, Cincinnati had already been on the practice field, so their practice
Right.
was open. Alabama had yet to practice. Alabama apparently said yes, we'll close hours. Georgia said yes. Michigan said yes. Cincinnati said yes, apparently starting tomorrow morning when they have their next practice. So, the point behind that, I'm not totally sure. You're talking about these big stadiums, like they're practicing in AT&T Stadium that has 140 million cubic feet. I don't know if a couple of reporters sitting in the stands wearing masks are really going to be a threat to the team as far as COVID's related.
You're
But
practically outside in that Cowboys
right,
stadium, really.
right, and there's all sorts of ventilation and all that, and that's I think what the science has shown as far as like a lot of these big crowds being at sporting events, especially the outdoor ones, is that there's not a huge threat. But as far as if the teams are given the opportunity to close practice, they're going to, because I think
Yep.
they don't want us to be looking at who's there, who's not there, who's practicing where, because all that information eventually goes to the opponent. So if they're given the opportunity to say no, they certainly will. But overall, yeah, it does seem like COVID it's a story this week, but Alabama doesn't have any problems beyond O'Brien and Marone, who will be back for the game. Cincinnati, I asked Luke Fickle the other night, Sunday night now, and he didn't really answer me directly. But it didn't really seem like it was a big issue on his end as well. And I think it's just a matter of, okay, do guys really stay in this week, or do they go out and potentially expose themselves? I know a couple Cincinnati players were talking about going to the Cowboys game yesterday, but then we talked to Pete Golding today, and he
Yeah, there
said,
was a
"Well,
comment, an
guys
interesting
are worried."
comment from Golding about that, right?
Yeah, you wonder if he had heard some of the other comments, but he essentially said, "Yeah, we're not going to the Cowboys game, or we're not going to Six Flags, or any of that." And it kind of seemed like a direct response to what some of the Bearcats guys were saying. And
Yeah.
even when Jerome Ford had mentioned going to the Cowboys game, I think somebody followed up with, well, how do you feel about that in light of COVID? And I think the question kind of got cut off on the Zoom. So there wasn't much more going on there.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, look, this is ultimately. It does seem like most years this is what Saban wants. He wants the team completely focused on the game. He doesn't. He doesn't. He's not really interested in the bowl experience, so to speak. I think he's even complained in the past about certain destinations for games being a bit distracting. We know that he said that maybe about Miami and New Orleans before. So this is a familiar environment for this team. They were just there a year ago for the playoffs. So a lot of these guys kind of have already been there, done that, perhaps not feeling like they need to take that once in a lifetime opportunity to go and see the city. But we will certainly continue to monitor this situation as the week goes on. But as Mike said, looking pretty good right now in terms of whether this game is going to be able to be played without COVID having a major impact. So that's certainly good news to hear. Um, Mike, anything before we wrap up? Anything you're particularly looking forward to out of the offensive side tomorrow, or guys you're looking forward to talking to?
Well, first, I was just going to say this is probably a good year to have a national championship game in Indianapolis because I don't think players will be going anywhere
No,
with or
there's
without
not
COVID.
there's not going to be a great deal of clamor to go out and see the sights of Indianapolis. Yeah.
Yeah, it's cold this time of year too up there, so that's yeah, I've been up there for a lot of combines, NFL combines
Hmm.
in February, and I'm sure it'll be pretty similar in the middle of January. But yeah, as far as the offense tomorrow, I mean, this is like with Golding, it's really the only opportunity for us to talk to Bill O'Brien, and there's probably similar questions with O'Brien, and I don't think, from what I can remember, I don't think we got into it with Golding as far as being a head coach and sort of what his future might be. But Bill O'Brien's already been a head coach, and he's been a head coach at the NFL level and the college level, and just what's next for him. You know, how long does he want to do this at Alabama, and kind of how does he see himself? Like it's people sometimes look at this as like a rehab job where you come and land, and
Sure.
Steve Sarkisian did it and then became a head coach after 2 years. Like what's Bill O'Brien's next step? Because he's still young enough where he's going to have another shot at it. Um, it's an interesting guy there, just a big name nationally that I've covered before. I actually covered him in New England, and I know there was an ESPN story a couple months ago that he was sort of waiting for Belichick to retire, potentially become the next head coach there. So we'll have to see.
Yeah. So lots to look forward to as the week goes on. We will continue to have more updates for you guys on this show every single day from Mike and from his other colleagues that will all be down there in Dallas as really in the next couple of days. I know you guys are getting down there. I'll be following you shortly behind. So thanks to Mike and thanks to everybody for watching today on AL.com's Playoff Central presented by Medical Properties Trust. I am Matt Scalisi, and we will see you guys again tomorrow, right here, wherever you're watching it. So we will check you guys out tomorrow. Thanks.
Medical Properties Trust, at the very heart